Life has a funny way of showing us that things aren't always what they seem. Take it from someone who learned this lesson the hard way. Let me tell you about Michelle Chen, a woman who thought she had everything figured out until she didn't. Michelle's mornings usually started the same way. The soft glow of sunrise peeking through her penthouse windows, the smell of fresh coffee brewing, and the gentle hum of the city below. At 32, she had built herself a life that many would envy. Her real estate company had just closed its biggest deal yet, selling a historic building in the heart of the city for a record-breaking price. Her Instagram was filled with pictures of success, charity galas, business meetings, and weekend getaways in her sleek sports car. But the real pride of her life was David, her boyfriend of 3 years. He was everything she thought she wanted: successful, charming, and seemingly devoted to their relationship. They had met at a charity fundraiser where he had impressed her with his knowledge of architecture and his genuine interest in her work. Their relationship had blossomed quickly, and before she knew it, they were the power couple everyone talked about. That morning, as Michelle sipped her coffee and scrolled through her emails, she noticed something different about David. He was rushing through breakfast, barely touching his food, his eyes glued to his phone. This hadn't been the first time she'd noticed changes in his behavior lately. The man who used to surprise her with lunch dates and leave sweet notes on her desk now seemed distant, always busy with work. "Everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "You've been working late a lot this week." "Just a big project," he mumbled, not looking up from his phone. "Might have to skip dinner again tonight." Michelle felt that familiar twinge of uncertainty in her stomach. Lately, their conversations had become shorter, their evenings together rarer. She tried to remember the last time they had a proper date night, or even a meaningful conversation that wasn't about work or their schedules. As she watched him hurry out the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The slight smirk she caught on his face as he turned away, the way he'd been insisting she give him access to her business accounts for tax purposes, the mysterious phone calls he took in the other room, all these little things started to form a pattern in her mind. But Michelle pushed these thoughts aside. After all, this was David, the man who had stood by her through the toughest year of her career, who had helped her navigate the cutthroat real estate market, who had introduced her to some of her biggest clients. She trusted him completely, or at least she thought she did. What Michelle didn't know was that every morning, after leaving their penthouse, David would make a call to someone saved in his phone as Project M. Their conversations were brief but intense, filled with updates about Michelle's schedule, her business meetings, and her emotional state. David had spent months studying her patterns, learning her vulnerabilities, and setting up the pieces for what would become the biggest betrayal of her life. Back in her office, Michelle stared at the contract David had asked her to sign the previous week, something about joint investment opportunities. She had put it off, saying she needed time to review it. Now, as she looked at the complex legal language, a small voice in her head urged her to have it checked by her own lawyer first. Her assistant knocked on the door, breaking her train of thought. "Miss Chen, your 10 o'clock is here. And there's someone new at the coffee shop downstairs. He asked about our property listings and mentioned he's looking for a major investment opportunity." Michelle nodded, pushing the contract aside. She had no way of knowing that both the mysterious coffee shop visitor and the contract were part of an elaborate plan, one that had been in motion long before she'd even noticed the first signs of trouble in her perfect life. As she gathered her papers for the meeting, her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Miss you. Dinner tomorrow to make up for this week?" She smiled, typing back a quick yes. Maybe she was just being paranoid. Maybe everything was fine. But in the world of high stakes and hidden motives, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. And Michelle was about to learn that the hardest way possible. The coffee shop downstairs from Michelle's office had become her sanctuary over the years. Every afternoon at 3, she would escape the pressure of meetings and phone calls to spend 15 minutes in this cozy corner of peace. The baristas knew her order by heart, an oat milk latte with an extra shot of espresso, no sugar. That Tuesday afternoon felt different somehow. Maybe it was the unusual chill in the air, or perhaps it was the weight of David's continued distance that made her notice the new face behind his laptop in her usual corner. He had an air of quiet confidence about him, dressed in a well-fitted navy suit that spoke of success without shouting it. As Michelle waited for her coffee, she couldn't help but overhear his conversation with the barista. He was discussing real estate investments in the area, mentioning figures that made it clear he knew what he was talking about. When their eyes met briefly, he smiled politely and returned to his work. The next day, he was there again. This time, he was speaking on the phone about a development project in the city's historic district, one that Michelle's company had actually considered bidding on. Before she could stop herself, she found herself drawn into the conversation. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said after he hung up. "Are you talking about the Wilson Street project?" His name was Alex, he told her, and he was an investment consultant looking to diversify his portfolio into real estate. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on market trends, development opportunities, and the challenges of urban renovation. For the first time in weeks, Michelle felt truly engaged in a conversation that wasn't laden with the awkward tension that had begun to characterize her interactions with David. Over the next few weeks, these coffee shop encounters became a regular occurrence. Alex was always there at 3, always with interesting insights about the market, always ready with a thoughtful question about her latest projects. He never pushed for more than professional conversation, which made Michelle feel safe in their growing friendship. One particularly stressful afternoon, after a meeting where David had inexplicably failed to show up to support her presentation to major investors, Michelle found herself sharing more than just business talk with Alex. "You seem troubled today," he observed, sliding a chocolate croissant across the table. "You mentioned this was your favorite stress food last week." The gesture, so simple yet thoughtful, made something in Michelle's chest tighten. When was the last time David had remembered any small detail about her preferences? "It's nothing," she said, but found herself continuing anyway. "Just feeling a bit disconnected lately. Work stress, I suppose." Alex listened with genuine interest as she vaguely described her relationship struggles, careful not to reveal too much. "Sometimes," he said, "we hold on to what we think is perfect because we're afraid of admitting it might not be." His words hit home harder than Michelle wanted to admit. That evening, as she sat alone in her penthouse again, David had texted to say he was working late. She found herself thinking about Alex's gentle insights and unwavering attention. What Michelle didn't see was Alex's other life, the careful reports he sent each evening about their conversations, the strategic way he positioned himself to be her emotional support exactly when she needed it most. She didn't notice how he always seemed to be available whenever she was most vulnerable, or how his business interests perfectly aligned with her expertise. The next week, when David canceled their dinner plans for the 3rd time, Michelle received a text from Alex. "There's an interesting property viewing tomorrow evening. Might be perfect for that international client you mentioned. Would you like to take a look?" She stared at the message for a long time. Something about it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. One step could change everything. Her finger hovered over the reply button just as another text from David came through. "Sorry about dinner. Something came up at work. Rain check." The contrast between the two messages, one offering professional opportunity and attention, the other another dismissal, made her decision feel almost inevitable. "What time is the viewing?" she typed back to Alex. That night, as Michelle prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, more alive, more uncertain, more ready for change. She told herself this was just business, just networking, just maintaining professional relationships. But deep down, in a place she wasn't ready to acknowledge, Michelle knew she was stepping onto a path that would change everything. What she didn't know was that every step of this path had been carefully laid out long before she ever set foot on it. Up in his private office across town, David smiled as he read the evening's report. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The property viewing with Alex turned out to be at one of the city's most prestigious addresses, a penthouse even more impressive than Michelle's own. As they walked through the elegantly furnished rooms, the setting sun painted the walls in shades of gold and amber. The space was perfect for Alex's supposed international client, but something felt off about the whole situation. The client might be running late, Alex mentioned casually, walking towards the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Would you like some water while we wait?" Michelle checked her phone again. No messages from David, just like the last 3 hours. Earlier that day, they'd had their worst argument yet. She'd confronted him about missing her important presentation, and his response had been dismissive, almost cold. "You're being paranoid," he'd said. "Maybe you should focus more on your work and less on analyzing my schedule." Those words had stung more than she wanted to admit. Standing here now, in this beautiful space with someone who actually seemed to value her professional opinion, Michelle felt a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. "The view up here is incredible," Alex said, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne. "Sometimes I think we get so caught up in selling these properties that we forget to appreciate them ourselves." Michelle smiled, trying to maintain professional distance despite the intimate setting. "The client is quite late," she noted, checking her watch. "Maybe we should reschedule." "Actually," Alex said softly, "I have a confession to make." "There is no client." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I wanted to talk to you somewhere private," he continued, turning to face her. "I've seen how unhappy you've been lately. How he treats you. You deserve better than that." The room suddenly felt too warm, too small. "Alex, I don't think." "Just listen," he interrupted gently. "I've watched you light up when you talk about your work, seen how brilliant you are at what you do. But I've also seen you dim every time your phone rings with his name. You're too special to be treated like an afterthought." His words hit every vulnerable spot in her heart, every doubt she'd been trying to ignore. When he stepped closer, Michelle knew she should step back, should leave, should remember her relationship with David. Instead, she found herself frozen in place, caught between what she should do and what she wanted to do. "I would never treat you like that," Alex whispered, his hand brushing her arm. "I would appreciate every moment, every conversation, every smile." The kiss, when it happened, felt both inevitable and surprising. It was gentle at first, then deeper, filled with all the attention and appreciation she'd been missing. Michelle's mind screamed at her to stop, but her heart was tired of being lonely in a relationship that was supposed to make her happy. What happened next felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare in disguise. The elegant penthouse became their private world for a few precious hours. Alex was everything David hadn't been lately, attentive, present, focused entirely on her. In those moments, Michelle forgot about her troubles, about David's distance, about the nagging feeling that something in her life had gone terribly wrong. It wasn't until later, as she lay in her own bed at home, that the full weight of what she'd done crashed over her. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from David, the first time he'd called multiple times in weeks. The guilt mixed with a strange sense of defiance. Why should she feel guilty when he'd been practically pushing her away? Sleep didn't come easily that night. Michelle tossed and turned, replaying the evening's events in her mind. The way Alex had known exactly what to say, how the penthouse had been perfectly set up, how everything had felt simultaneously right and wrong, these thoughts chased each other through her dreams. What she couldn't see were the tiny cameras hidden throughout that luxurious penthouse, capturing every moment of her indiscretion. She didn't know about the encrypted files being uploaded to a secure server, or about the satisfied smile on David's face as he watched the evening's events unfold on his laptop screen. In his darkened office, David raised a glass to his computer screen. "Oh, Michelle," he murmured to himself, "you really should have read those contracts more carefully." The digital clock on his desk ticked over to midnight, marking the beginning of what would become the most devastating day of Michelle's life. The trap had been sprung, and there was no going back now. As the city slept, unaware of the drama unfolding in its midst, the pieces of David's master plan clicked into place one by one. Tomorrow would bring a storm that would shake Michelle's world to its foundations, and she had no idea it was coming. Morning arrived with the harsh buzz of Michelle's alarm. Her head felt heavy with guilt and confusion from the previous night's events. As she reached for her phone, she noticed something odd. Dozens of missed calls and messages from numbers she recognized: clients, business partners, friends. Her heart began to race as she opened the first message. The world seemed to stop spinning as she read it. There, in her inbox, was a series of photos, nothing explicit, but damning nonetheless. Her and Alex in the penthouse, their professional boundaries clearly crossed. The email had been sent to everyone in her contact list: clients, colleagues, even her mother. Her fingers trembling, Michelle dialed her office. Her assistant answered with a shaky voice: "Miss Chen, I think you should come in right away." The drive to her office felt like moving through a nightmare. Every red light gave her time to check more messages, each one worse than the last. By the time she pulled into her parking spot, she knew her carefully built reputation was crumbling around her. Walking through her office lobby, she could feel the stares, hear the whispers. People who'd greeted her warmly just yesterday now averted their eyes or huddled in corners, phones in hand, presumably looking at the evidence of her indiscretion. "Your 9 a.m. cancelled," her assistant said as Michelle entered her office. "Actually, all your meetings for today have been cancelled." And Mr. Reynolds from the Wilson Street project called. They're going with another firm." Michelle sank into her chair, her mind racing. How had this happened? Who had taken those photos? The penthouse, it must have been rigged with cameras. But why? Who would do this? Her phone buzzed again, David's name flashing on the screen. She answered, her throat tight. "Michelle." His voice was cold, controlled. "Can to explain the emails I've been receiving." "David, she started, but he cut her off. "I trusted you," he said, his voice cracking with what seemed like genuine pain. "I've been working so hard, trying to build a future for us, and this is how you repay me." The guilt that had been gnawing at her suddenly shifted to confusion. "Working hard? You've been distant for weeks, canceling plans, missing meetings." "Because I was planning our future," he shouted. "I was setting up investment opportunities, building connections for us. I have proof of everything, Michelle. Every meeting, every call. While you were with him." The line went dead. Minutes later, her email pinged again. This time, it was a message from their shared lawyer, the one David had recommended months ago. Attached were documents she'd signed, giving David partial control over her business decisions in case of personal incapacity or professional misconduct. Her phone kept buzzing, more clients pulling out, more judgmental messages. She tried calling Alex, but his number was disconnected. The coffee shop said they'd never had an employee or regular customer by that name. A knock on her office door made her jump. It was her business partner, Chen Lai, looking grave. "Michelle, we need to talk about the company's reputation. These photos, they're everywhere. Our biggest clients are threatening to pull out. The board is calling an emergency meeting." "It's not what it looks like," Michelle started, but even she could hear how weak that sounded. "The board meeting is at 2 p.m., Chen Lai said flatly. "I suggest you bring your lawyer." "A different one from David's," he added meaningfully. Alone in her office again, Michelle began to piece things together. The timing of Alex's appearance, how he always seemed to know exactly what to say, the perfectly staged penthouse. She pulled out the contract David had asked her to sign weeks ago, the one she put aside to review. Reading it now, with fresh eyes and growing suspicion, she began to see the trap she'd walked into. Her computer dinged with another email. This one was from an anonymous address, containing just one line, "Check the timestamps on the photos carefully." Michelle opened the attachments again, forcing herself to look past the embarrassing images to the metadata. The photos weren't just from last night. They showed Alex meeting with someone weeks ago, planning, discussing. The image was blurry, but she'd know David's profile anywhere. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This hadn't been a coincidence. This hadn't even been about her infidelity. This had been a carefully orchestrated plan, months in the making, designed to destroy everything she'd built. Her office phone lit up. The board members were calling an earlier meeting. In less than an hour, she would have to face them and somehow explain how she'd let herself become a pawn in someone else's game. As she gathered her things, a final email arrived. From David. "I'll have my lawyer contact you about buying out your share of the business. Given the circumstances, I think you'll find my offer very generous." Michelle stared at her computer screen, her shock slowly turning to something else. Determination. She'd built this company from nothing once before. If she had to do it again, she would. But first, she needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went. The boardroom felt colder than usual as Michelle sat facing the stunned faces of her company's board members. Her hands were steady as she placed her laptop on the polished table, but her mind was racing through every document she'd signed over the past year. "Let's address the elephant in the room," said Mr. Wang, the head of the board. "These photos have already cost us 3 major clients. Our stock is dropping. We need damage control." Before Michelle could respond, the door opened. David walked in, followed by two men in expensive suits, lawyers, judging by their briefcases and stern expressions. "I believe I can help with that," David said smoothly, placing a thick folder on the table. "As a major stakeholder in this company, I have a solution." Michelle's head snapped up. "Major stakeholder? You don't have any shares in my company." David's smile didn't reach his eyes as he opened the folder. "Actually, I do. Remember that investment protection agreement you signed 3 months ago? The one I said would help protect our future together." The board members leaned forward as David's lawyer distributed copies of documents bearing Michelle's signature. She remembered signing them, of course. It had been during that week when she was closing the biggest deal of her career. David had said it was just routine paperwork, something to ensure their investments were protected as a couple. Section 7, Paragraph 3, David's lawyer pointed out, "In the event of personal misconduct that damages company reputation, controlling interest transfers to the secondary signatory, in this case, Mr. David Parker." Michelle's hands shook as she read the fine print she'd missed before. Hidden in the complex legal language was a trap so clever, so well disguised, she never stood a chance. Every document she'd signed thinking it was about their future together had actually been another piece of the puzzle designed to take her company away. "You can't do this," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew enough about contract law to recognize when she'd been outplayed. "I think you'll find we can," David's second lawyer said. "Furthermore, given the sensitive nature of recent events, we're prepared to offer a generous severance package. You can walk away from this with your dignity partially intact." The board members exchanged glances. They'd known Michelle for years, trusted her leadership. But business was business, and scandal was bad for shareholders. "I need time to review these with my own lawyer," Michelle said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Of course," David replied smoothly. "You have 48 hours to accept our offer. After that, we'll have to take more aggressive legal action." As Michelle gathered her things to leave, she noticed something odd about one of the documents. The notary's stamp looked slightly different from the others. It was a tiny detail, something she might have missed if she hadn't spent years reviewing property documents. In the elevator down to the parking garage, she called her old college friend who worked at the city records office. "Remember when you said you owed me a favor? I need to know everything about a notary's license issued to someone named Patricia Wells." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Michelle set up camp in a small coffee shop, not her usual one, somewhere David wouldn't think to look for her. She spread out copies of every document she'd signed over the past year, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might help her understand the depth of David's deception. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend at the records office. "No Patricia Wells licensed as a notary in the past 5 years. But you'll never guess what I found." The attached photo showed a different name on the notary application, David's sister's name. The same sister who'd supposedly moved abroad 3 years ago. Pieces started falling into place. The late nights David claimed he was working, he'd been setting this up. The clients he'd introduced her to, the connections he'd helped her make, all carefully chosen to be part of his plan. Her phone buzzed again, an email from an unknown address. The subject line made her heart stop. "Want to know what really happened to David's last girlfriend?" Michelle's fingers hovered over the email. Opening it could be another trap, but at this point, what did she have to lose? The attachment was a news article from 5 years ago about another successful businesswoman who'd lost everything in a scandal. The woman's name was different, but the pattern was eerily familiar. As the sun set outside the coffee shop window, Michelle started making calls. Not to her usual lawyer, who David had recommended, but to someone new. Someone who specialized in fraud cases. She'd built her company from nothing once before, fighting against all odds. She could do it again. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for her company. She was fighting to expose a predator who had probably done this before and would certainly do it again if someone didn't stop him. Her new lawyer's words rang in her ears. "The best defense is a good offense. Let's dig deeper into his past. People like this always leave a trail, we just have to find it." Michelle looked at her reflection in the coffee shop window. The woman looking back at her wasn't broken, she was angry. and that anger was about to fuel something David never saw coming. The anonymous email about David's past had opened a door Michelle couldn't close. Working from her temporary office, a quiet corner of the public library, she dove deep into research mode. Each new discovery felt like another piece of a disturbing puzzle falling into place. Her new lawyer, Mrs. Rivera, spread out documents across the library table. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to dates on various papers. 3 different cities, 3 successful businesswomen, 3 similar scandals, all connected to David, just under different names. Michelle's throat tightened as she studied the documents. How did nobody notice this before? "He's clever," Mrs. Rivera replied. "He changes just enough details each time. Different business sectors, different approaches. But the core strategy is always the same: gain trust, isolate the target, create a scandal, then swoop in with legal documents that were signed months before." A notification popped up on Michelle's laptop, an email from Alex's former secretary. After hours of searching social media and professional networks, Michelle had finally tracked her down. The message was brief but explosive. "I can't live with the guilt anymore. Check your secure email in 10 minutes. I'm sending you everything." The waiting felt like hours. When the files finally arrived, Michelle's hands shook as she opened them. Video files, dozens of them, showing David and Alex in meetings months before Michelle had ever met Alex at the coffee shop. They were planning everything: the chance encounters, the emotional manipulation, even the exact words Alex would use to gain her trust. "Look at the date on this one," Michelle pointed to a video thumbnail. It was from 6 months ago, showing David in his office. "That's the day he first suggested I sign those investment protection documents." Mrs. Rivera leaned closer to watch. In the video, David was explaining to Alex how to play his part. "She's smart." David's voice came through clearly, but like all successful people, she has a weakness. "She's lonely at the top. Use that. Make her feel understood." The footage continued, revealing meeting after meeting where David orchestrated every detail of Michelle's downfall. He had studied her schedule, her habits, even her favorite coffee order. Nothing had been left to chance. "Wait," Michelle paused one video. "Freeze that frame." In the background of David's office, there was a whiteboard with a list of names. 3 were crossed out, the same 3 businesswomen they'd discovered earlier. Michelle's name was 4th on the list, with several others below it. "He's not planning to stop with me," Michelle whispered. "There are more targets." Just then, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Back entrance of the library. 5 minutes. I have more proof." Mrs. Rivera grabbed Michelle's arm. "It could be a trap. Or it could be someone else who knows the truth," Michelle countered. They decided to be cautious. Mrs. Rivera would watch from inside, while Michelle met the mysterious messenger in the public space outside. The person waiting turned out to be a security guard from David's office building. "I've worked there for 3 years," he explained, nervously glancing around. "Seen him do this twice before. Always felt wrong, but didn't have proof until now." He handed over a USB drive. "Security cameras in his office record everything. He doesn't know about the backup system. Last week, I heard him on the phone, planning something similar for a businesswoman in Boston. Couldn't let it happen again." Back inside, the USB drive revealed footage that made Michelle's blood run cold. David, in his office, laughing with his lawyers about how easy it was to manipulate successful women. "They're all the same," he said in one clip. "So focused on their careers, so desperate for connection. By the time they realize what's happening, it's too late." As Michelle and Mrs. Rivera worked late into the evening, more pieces emerged. They discovered offshore accounts where David had hidden money from his previous schemes. They found connections to fake companies he'd set up to launder the profits. Each revelation painted a picture of a man who had turned destroying successful women into a profitable business model. "We need to move fast," Mrs. Rivera said, organizing the evidence. "He's probably already planning his next target, but we have to be strategic about this. One wrong move, and he could destroy all this evidence." Michelle nodded, a plan forming in her mind. "You know what successful people have in common," she said, thinking about David's words from the video. "We learn from our mistakes, and we know how to turn a bad situation into an opportunity." She opened her laptop and began typing an email to the board members. Not a defensive explanation, but a careful, calculated message that would start the dominoes falling in her favor. "David thinks he knows everything about me," Michelle said as she typed. "But he missed something important. I didn't build my company by giving up when things got tough. I built it by being smarter than people who underestimated me." The library was nearly empty now, but Michelle and Mrs. Rivera were just getting started. Tomorrow would be about more than saving one company or exposing one man's crimes. It would be about stopping a predator before he could destroy any more lives. As they gathered their evidence, Michelle's phone lit up with another message, this time from one of David's previous victims. "I saw what happened to you in the news. I'm ready to tell my story too." The tide was turning. David's perfectly planned scheme was about to unravel thread by carefully pulled thread. The morning of the emergency board meeting dawned bright and clear. Michelle stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her suit jacket with steady hands. The fear and shock of the past few days had been replaced by something stronger: purpose. The company's main conference room was packed. Board members, shareholders, and even a few reporters sat waiting. David sat at the head of the table, looking confident, a slight smirk playing on his lips. His lawyers flanked him like guards. "Before we begin," Michelle said, her voice clear and strong, "I'd like to introduce some people." She opened the door, and several women walked in. David's smirk faltered slightly as he recognized them, his previous victims, each one carrying a folder of documents. "You all know why we're here," Michelle continued. "Mr. Parker claims I've damaged this company's reputation. He's right about one thing: there has been damage. But not from me." She nodded to Mrs. Rivera, who started the presentation. On the large screen, evidence began to appear: the security footage, the fake notary stamps, the offshore accounts. With each revelation, David's face grew paler. "This isn't just about one scandal," Michelle explained to the stunned board members. "This is about a calculated scheme that's been repeated multiple times. A scheme that has targeted successful businesses and women across the country." One of the women stood up. "He did the same thing to me in Chicago," she said. "Different name, same pattern. I lost everything and had to start over." Another woman spoke up. "Boston 2 years ago. He called himself Daniel there." David's lawyers were frantically whispering to him now. But Michelle wasn't finished. She played the video of David in his office, bragging about how easy it was to manipulate successful women. The room fell silent as his own words condemned him. The notary who supposedly validated these documents. Michelle pointed to the contracts David had used to claim ownership of her company. "She doesn't exist, but the person who forged her signature does." She nodded to a police detective who had been quietly sitting in the corner. "And she's ready to testify." David stood up abruptly. "This is all circumstantial. You can't prove." "Actually, we can," Mrs. Rivera interrupted, placing a USB drive on the table. "Your security guard has quite a collection of backup footage. You really should have been nicer to your employees." The board members were passing around copies of bank statements showing the money trail from David's previous schemes. His lawyers had stopped whispering and were now packing their briefcases. "Mr. Parker," the head of the board said, his voice cold, "I believe the police have some questions for you." As David was led away by detectives, Michelle turned to address the shareholders and reporters. This company was built on trust and integrity. While recent events have tested that foundation, they've also made it stronger. We now have the opportunity to not just rebuild, but to create something better. She outlined her plan: a new initiative to help protect businesses from similar schemes, a partnership with cybersecurity experts to prevent digital manipulation, and a foundation to support women entrepreneurs who had been victims of fraud. The votes were unanimous. Not only would Michelle retain full control of her company, but the board approved her new initiatives with immediate funding. Later that evening, as the sun set over the city, Michelle sat in her office, her real office, looking at the messages pouring in. Women from across the country were reaching out, sharing similar stories, offering support and collaboration. Her assistant knocked on the door. "The FBI is here. They think Mr. Parker's scheme might have reached multiple states. They want to talk about building a larger case." Michelle nodded. "Send them in. And call Mrs. Rivera. We're going to need a bigger legal team." As she waited, Michelle opened her laptop to check the company's stock price. It had not only recovered but was rising steadily as news of the exposed scheme spread. The headlines were already changing from scandal to survival, from shame to strength. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of the women who had helped expose David. "Thank you for being brave enough to fight back. You've given hope to so many of us." Michelle smiled, thinking about how different things had looked just a few days ago. She had lost trust, yes, but she had gained something more valuable: wisdom, strength, and a new purpose. The company would recover. The truth would come out. And somewhere out there, another woman might read this story and recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk, Michelle felt a deep sense of peace. Sometimes, she realized, you have to lose everything to discover just how strong you really are. Her assistant poked her head in again. "Your dinner meeting is here. The tech startup founders who want to collaborate on the security initiative." Michelle stood up, straightening her jacket. There was work to be done, a legacy to build, and a future to protect. The phoenix wasn't just rising, it was soaring.